welcome. It's so great to see you all here, and also welcome to those who are participating by Zoom today. My name is Elizabeth Lyon Hall. I'm the director of COLLIS Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture. COLLIS is a nonprofit and an affiliate of Cornell United Religious Work at Cornell University, and our mission is to develop Catholic thought, culture, and community on Cornell campus through public lectures, non-credit courses, seminars, concerts, and cultural events. This lecture is made possible through the support of the grant in Lumine, supporting the Catholic intellectual tradition on campuses nationwide from the John Templeton Foundation. Today, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Larry Chapp, manager of the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm in Harveys Lake, Pennsylvania. Dr. Chapp was a professor of theology at DeSales University before retiring in 2013 in order to found a Catholic worker farm with his wife and fellow theologian Carmina Chapp. He is the author of the books, The God of Covenant and Creation, and the recently published Confession of a Catholic Worker, Our Current Moment of Christian Witness. He is also an important voice in Catholic discourse on the state and direction of the contemporary Catholic Church, and he has appeared on programs such as Bishop Barron Presents. The Catholic worker movement was one of the most important spiritual movements of 20th century American Catholicism. Founded by the legendary Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, the movement is perhaps most well known for its commitment to social justice, to radical hospitality, voluntary poverty, and nonviolence. Those from the community might be familiar with these values from the committed work of our local Catholic workers who are celebrating their 20th year anniversary this year. Catholic workers are known for being doers, but this movement is also a vital part of the Catholic intellectual tradition and history of ideas. Today, we are privileged to learn about the intellectual foundation and legacy of this movement from a brilliant theologian and someone who is himself a Catholic worker. How do the fire of faith and clarity of reason fuel the way of life, the spiritual and corporeal practice of this movement? Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Chapp for a talk on faith, reason, and the praxis of the Catholic worker movement.
I'm indeed a brilliant theologian with an important voice. You're the opposite of the person who used to stand in front of Caesar whispering, "Sic transit gloria mundi." Now you're like, oh, important voice. I'm not certain my wife would always agree with that. But anyway, I want to thank the organizers of this event, and Lizzie in particular, for inviting me to speak to all of you today on a topic near and dear to my heart, namely Vatican II, the universal call to holiness, and the charism of Dorothy Day as it relates to all of that. I'm honored to be here today, and I hope my words can shed some light on our current situation, which is in many ways a situation of crisis, both in the church and in the broader culture of the West. I can't speak to other cultures. I'm a Westerner, and this is the culture to which I speak. I pray that the Holy Spirit will guide my reflections today and keep me from being a blooming idiot, which if left to my own devices, I most certainly would be. My reflections today will cover Dorothy Day, Vatican II, the universal call to holiness, modern culture, and an analysis of where Day fits into all that. I do that in 45 minutes. Good luck. Maybe not. It'll be a wild ride. So let me then begin by saying that I'm not here today to give an infomercial on Dorothy Day in order to impart to you the basic facts of her life and what she stood for, blah, 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 in this boilerplate way. I'm not here to sell you on Dorothy Day like a huckster on TV trying to sell you an air fryer or a chicken rotisserie machine. I'm here rather to alarm you and to embed my discussion of Dorothy Day within that alarm. It is not good enough to just lay out the facts of her life and her message in a purely academic manner, feigning some kind of scholarly objectivity that is above the fray. It is not good enough because it can leave you with the impression that her message is something we can take or leave as simply one point of view of many, one lifestyle choice. I'm not here, in other words, to describe the Dorothy Day option. I'm here to discuss the Dorothy Day mandate. In order to adequately describe her ongoing significance for our times, I need to begin by establishing, I think, the nature of the crisis that we face. Because only when we diagnose the disease can we prescribe the proper cure. In a nutshell, the crisis we face is the crisis presented to us by modernity and the church's flawed response to modernity. both on the right, on the left, and in the safe center. The term modernity is, of course, a very plastic term that can mean very many different things, very protean. I'm using it here today to denote very specifically the culture that arose in the West in the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, which was then followed by the scientific and industrial and technological revolutions, and then the rise of various iterations of modern political liberalism, whether it's an Anglophone or Francophone register. This has led to a culture which lives entirely on the horizontal axis of existence, and which defines reality in purely mundane and horizontalist categories. It is a culture, to use the term of Charles Taylor, that is buffered against transcendence, and thus entirely lives within what he called the immanent frame, with no explicit linkages to transcendence as a point of social reference, as something publicly real and significant, and that's key. Popes John Paul and Benedict have named this reality as well, and referred to the eclipse of God in our culture, the eclipse of God. And by the eclipse of God, they do not mean a simple rise in the number of atheists and agnostics and religiously unaffiliated people. That's rather boring, since all cultures of all times have always had their fair share of those kinds of village atheists. Rather, what they meant is something far deeper, far more aboriginal, more constitutive, more cataclysmic. What they meant was what I call the nullification of the very question of God as a meaningful public reality. It is the annulment of the memory of God, as if the question of his existence, and hence of his importance, is to be expunged as meaningless and dangerous. It is the nullification of the legitimacy of transcendence as a conceptual category at all, followed then by its reduction to a mere epiphenomenal eruption of conflicting emotional states rooted in the psychology of our evolutionary past. In other words, transcendence as a category that is not pointing to something real and salutary and therefore consequential, but to something neurotic and grounded in our simian desire to mark our territory and the remnants of our reptilian brain's desire to stay warm in the cold. This is modernity, and it is this reality that Hans Urs von Balthasar, the theologian I did my dissertation on, referred to simply as the system. The system. He viewed it as a hegemonic and latently totalitarian attempt to circumscribe what counts as the really real within the strict boundaries of an intramundane prison of material relations. Dorothy Day understood this as well, and understood modernity in exactly the same way. And her entire apolitical politics was grounded in this analysis. To cite several paradigmatic examples of this, we see for starters that her famous political anarchism was not an antinomian rejection of the moral law or of law in general, but a rejection instead of the true and deeper antinomianism, the false antinomianism that is the leviathan of the modern nation state, with its claim to a monopoly on all the means of social coercion and its claim to metaphysical neutrality, which is, of course, abject nonsense. Her pacifism was a rejection. Her anarchism led to her pacifism, was a rejection of the inherent violence and militarism that is absolutely necessary for these fundamentally antinomian states to survive. Since absent a link to transcendence as the ground of the good, there remains only relations of power on the horizontal level, conceived of in terms of power as pure force, metaphysically speaking. We speak a lot today of human and civil rights, and that's good. And the modern order is putatively grounded in such an affirmation. But these rights are not linked to a notion of the good, but are purely stipulative and somewhat, therefore, arbitrary, and change as quickly as the mood of the social contract changes. And since such rights are not grounded in any deep-seated rationale, once they are stipulated, they must be policed and imposed by force. This then is the final move, and force doesn't mean physical force, coercive force of all kinds. And the modern surveillance state is capable of all kinds of that kind of coercion. This then is the final move towards violence, since as the late Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce points out, the essence of all totalitarianisms resides in the subjection of culture ultimately to politics, the reduction of culture to mere political categories. which requires periodic war making in order to bleed the lines of the excess pressure that is built up within the social matrix caused by the resolution of cultural fractiousness via the path of coercive power. War making, in other words, in modernity, is state making, which is why the modern state, which emerged out of the ashes of the religious wars of, say, the 16th, 17th centuries, and putatively arose in order to keep the peace. Peace became the greatest genocidal and war-making things the world has ever seen. Her voluntary Dorothy, to return to Dorothy Day, her voluntary poverty and work for the poor was, along with an embracing of the dominical commandments to feed the poor, a rejection of the cult of bourgeois capitalist well-being. Here she followed Berdyaev, among others, and today finds a resonance in folks like Eugene McCarraher at Villanova, whose magisterial tome, The Enchantments of Mammon, it's a lifetime book. Read it when you have like 10 years to waste. It's like this thick, but it's a great book. The Enchantments of Mammon deftly scopes out the almost mystical character of modern wealth creation as the greatest totem in the modern pantheon of the strong gods of Blut und Erde, blood and soil. Dorothy's voluntary poverty was thus not a white-knuckled asceticism ordered to a denial of the goods of this earth, but a prophetic critique of the modern worship of Mammon, which is itself linked to Moloch, all right, war-making. John Paul referred to this as the culture of death, and he was not speaking vaguely or metaphorically. Thus, her voluntary poverty, far from being a world-hating asceticism, was a life-affirming practice intended to break the chains of our Mammon-Moloch idolatry. In other words, Dorothy Day was no mere do-gooder or just a radical philanthropist with Jesus sprinkles on top of the ice cream of her social work. She was a prophet and a pain in the ass. Sorry. She was the irritant in the oyster that creates the pearl, which in this case is the pearl of great price, which is the holiness that living the gospel brings. And she shares with Balthasar as well this Christocentrism of the crucified Lord, the Lamb who was slain from all eternity, and who stands in opposition to this system, which is really, at the end of the day, what the book of Revelation is all about. The biblical apocalyptic literature is, in its essence, a response to all immanent frames, since it smashes the categories of a strict immanence with a message of the inbreaking of the crucified Lamb, who now exists beyond the perfidies and pretensions of the world and stands athwart them in judgment. Think about this for a second. The apocalyptic of Christianity is that a crucified man rules the universe. All right? That's the central motif of the book of Revelation. The Lamb who was slain from all eternity stands in judgment. There's a great one anyway, I don't know. Ours, therefore, according to Dorothy Day, is an era of crisis in the strict sense, a turning point, a decisional moment that Balthasar called die Ernstfall in his German, which is a German word that simply means a point in time when we are forced to choose for or against something, in this case, Christ. It denotes a choice, a deep existential choice that cannot be avoided, since not to choose is in fact a choice in favor of the status quo of the system, to simply drift downstream with the system. The metric of all truth, according to Dorothy Day, is the Lamb who was slain. And this metric, though hidden under the varnished layers of violence in human history, must be the cruciform pattern of our own existence. This is Balthasar's point in his book, To the Moment of Christian Witness. All right? The essence of Christian existence is cruciform. You remove the cruciformity of the Christian faith and our discipleship to Christ, and you have destroyed the message of the Christian faith. Put another way, what I'm claiming is that Dorothy Day's significance can only be understood against the backdrop of Balthasar's Ernstfall, crisis of choice, that she believed was upon all of us. Constantinian Catholicism is dead. Cultural Catholicism is dead. We are now returned to the pagan realm of the morally indifferent, as I said, strong gods of Blut und Erde. And therefore she understood that only a return to a radical form of Christian existence can save us. All attempts at compromise with the bourgeois cult of well-being and its technocratic capitalist engine will fail and have failed, which is why the church, having attempted just such a compromise, has become a safe space of non-triggering velvet saints whose icons ooze the oil of Laodicea. We have lost the Constantinian church, but have never lost our desire to retrieve it, strangely, and thus fret over our relevance in puerile ways, like an adolescent seeking affirmation from his or her peers, and thus we tut-tut at those like Dorothy and Balthazar for being rigorous utopians out of touch with real life that real people have to really live in. But that reality so defined is the reality of bourgeois well-being, which militates against the universal call to holiness, which is toxic, and which in the church today is considered by many people as simply a subspecies of fanaticism. People think I'm a fanatic, and yet they think Dorothy Day was a fan. Balthazar, they would have thought the same. I'm not a saint, but they would have thought the saints were fanatics. Some of them were. Good, weird fanatics. That's good weird. And right she was about this condition we are in. I think right she was. Nietzsche says, wohin ist Gott? Where is God? Ich will es euch sagen. I will tell you. Gott ist tot. God's dead. Und Gott bleibt tot. God's going to remain dead. Und wir sind seine Mörder, ihr nicht. We are his murderers, you and I. Aber es dieses tun nichts so groß für uns. Es ist not too great for us. Nein, nein. You got to say it in German. It sounds better. It gives it more of a Nietzsche flair to it, right? Nein, nein, no. No, it's not too great a deed for us. Yeah. The later thinkers in the Enlightenment tradition understood, like Nietzsche, that the Enlightenment as such was still too tame, too domesticated within the boundaries of classical culture, morality, and reason. And thus do we get the modern masters of hermeneutical suspicion in Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, among others, who held that all love is veiled lust, all reason veiled power, and all justice veiled revenge. Therefore, modern Titanism must deconstruct such social illusions as the mere recrudescence of mystification and superstition. Thus is modernity characterized, as noted once again by Del Noce, by the mantra now become a dogma of our world. Today it is no longer possible to believe the following. Fill in the blank. All that was before modernity is thus erased in order for the binding address that was transcendence to be eliminated. Modern political constructions, with their de facto atheistic core, have as their chief goal the elimination of all such binding addresses other than that of the state. And I say that, I mean, the fact of the matter is, think of John Lennon's song, Imagine. What's the point of that song? The point of that song is, don't believe anything. Because as soon as you start believing in anything, that's what gets people kind of riled up and causes violence. The goal is not to believe anything, right? Imagine there's no heaven, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's a horrible song, actually. It's very nihilistic. It's a terrible song. And I guess, no, I don't know, I'm on a rant now. But the thing is, if you go back to the Enlightenment as well, you go back to the Enlightenment, all right? The myth of Enlightenment origin is a myth of original violence. That man is born sort of violent, and that it is religion that has corrupted him. And someone would add that the state is also corrupted, of course, into this great divide and all that. But anyway, the point is that there is this atheistic core at the heart of modern political constructions, insofar as the belief is that one has to prescind from all such meta-narratives, all such metaphysical commitments. Otherwise, one is going to be prone to violence. And that's why they have, as their goal is the elimination of all of these binding addresses emotionally. Or put another way, other than that of the system. And Dorothy understood American exceptionalism in this light and condemned its militarism, capitalist emphasis on wealth as the meaning of life, and its runaway cult of the religion of bourgeois well-being. C.S. Lewis once famously used the analogy of an egg to describe the necessity today of making the choice for or against Christ. I think Dorothy Day, she never quoted Lewis, but I think she would have agreed with this, because this is her point. Lewis said that spiritually speaking, we're all eggs, and like eggs, which we must either hatch or go bad. There's no such thing as an egg that can stay in stasis. There's no standing still. To choose that is to choose spoilage and death. I get emails all the time from former students of mine who are now parents and who are suffering through the fact that very few of their children remain religious believers. They ask me, what can we do to stop this? And the statistics today about young people in the Catholic Church are sobering and bear this out as a general trend. Millions of young people are simply walking away from the faith. Well, why is this? It's because the church has kicked the can of decisional crisis down the road, refused to take a strong countercultural stand in defiance to the system, and has put its head in the sand and opted for status quo, Don't rock the boat lest the envelopes dry up thinking. I mean, after all, somebody has to pay for all those Catholic schools that churn out future lapsed Catholics by the thousands. The church has opted to make the parish safe with the culture of the cul-de-sac, and our churches even look like cul-de-sacs. And it's thus neutered its eschatological essence at its roots, rendering the church so dull and lackluster that it is in no way any longer compelling. And we wonder why our children see nothing of value in it, why it all just seems so inauthentic and boilerplate to them. Much of the church in the West has become the sock puppet of modern bourgeois culture. But the problem with sock puppets is that they all look alike. The church should be a hatchery for holiness, which was the point Dorothy Day and Peter Morin made over and over, but has instead become a place for warehousing the spoiled eggs of our mediocrity. We have told folks that they can have their cake and eat it too. They can take on the coloration and values of our culture and still be good Catholics. And I suppose we can in some sense, because our culture is not entirely evil, right? But for how long? The bourgeois center does not hold. Only the Christological center from a Catholic perspective holds when Catholic culture is lost, and all that is left is decisional choice. You can say I'm being hyperbolic and alarmist in an overly harsh and hortatory tone. I have a priest friend who is a pastor in New Hampshire, Father Mike Kerber, in Nashua. When he started as a priest in 1985, there were 185 active priests in his diocese. Today there are around 40. The number of baptism and marriages has imploded, let alone confirmations. Think of your own families. How many of you who are old enough to have grown children, as well as nephews and nieces, can honestly say that most of them are still Catholic? I know in my own family that this question cannot be answered in the affirmative. My own daughter has left the faith. All of my nephews and nieces left the faith. All of the nephews and nieces of my wife have left the faith. What does all of this have to do with Dorothy Day and Vatican II? In a word, everything. What I'm trying to establish is the status quo of the modus vivendi we have worked out with our culture is finally unraveling and is being exposed for the shell game that it was. In its place, we're being offered several flawed alternatives. We have the toxic romanticism of radical traditionalism, which sadly seems intent on returning to a most people are going to hell approach to salvation and evangelization, and a very narrow reading of the necessity of the church for salvation, such as most non-Catholics are going to hell. I just saw a talk from Ralph Martin saying just that. Non-Catholics can go to heaven, but it's really hard. Thank you, Ralph. Which is why they hate Vatican II, and Balthazar, and Bishop Barron, and Dorothy Day, and judging from the hate mail I get, me. I love the old Latin Mass. I do. I'm a high liturgy person myself. I attend an ordinary liturgy. And I wish Pope Francis had not clamped down on it. But if it is so inherently efficacious and superior, why did it create a pre-conciliar ecclesial culture of a purely contractual and forensic Catholicism that collapsed almost overnight? And as recent history has taught us, fit-a-back chasubles over lace surplices can hide just as many secret sins as your denim Disney chasuble over your Grateful Dead t-shirt. All right? I used to buy into the, because I was a very conservative little mini-me Torquemada when I was young. And I had history down, conservative Catholics, they're the Orthodox, they're the good guys, they don't do any of that sexual stuff. And it's all the liberals doing the sexual stuff. And then, of course, that's not true, right? Didn't take long to figure out, oh, Latin Mass, it's great, I love Latin Mass, but it's not a panacea for what ails us. There's also the neoconservative first things fantasy camp of a crypto-Catholic America just waiting for the Catholic moment to emerge. Richard Newhouse wrote that famous book, The Catholic Moment, to emerge as the spiritual prop for American exceptionalism and militarism in some fever dream of a natural law reading of the Constitution that exchanges ecclesial patristics with the patristics of America's blessed protological founding. And there seems to be no upward limit to the employment of Catholicism among these types for the blessing of our war-making. As we see as recently as a few months ago, my friend, I'm a friend of his, George Weigel, a great neocon, who defended, believe it or not, defended the morality of dropping atomic bombs on civilian populations so long as it's for a good cause. America. And so the man who rails against, George Weigel, rails against utilitarian ethics when applied to sexual matters in the church, suddenly discovers that even mass murder on a truly industrial scale has such a forceful utility, well, we just have to engage in it because, America. So a big no to the contraceptive pill, but a big yes to the bomb. Sweet. I like how that works. There is also the increasingly influential and resurgent Catholic progressivism that is, in my opinion, a little more these days than a theological front group for basically blessing most of the trendy cultural mores of the contemporary culture. At one time, the Catholic left was interesting and engaging. I knew, I grew up with it. Anti-war, anti-poverty, anti-state corruption, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. It was exciting, it was exhilarating to be alive at that time and to see what sort of, and why Dorothy Day she was not a communist, but she was very smitten with the fact that it seemed like the more left-wing agitators were the people who understood there is a deep crisis in our culture, a deep flaw in our capitalist political system, our militarist political system, and she had a sympathy with that. And the face of the Catholic left in America during that time was once a towering anti-war and anti-economic injustice figure, excuse me, like Father Daniel Berrigan. Now, what we see in the Catholic left is just a gaggle of clerical mediocrities obsessed with sex and first world bourgeois lifestyle issues, which is very decadent. And so we are presented with several ecclesial alternatives, all of which are dead ends. We are in a series of dead ends, all of which engage in ideologically motivated mystifications that occlude the cruciform nature of our true existence. Dorothy Day understood this, which is why she railed against the clericalization of holiness and the relegation of the Sermon on the Mount to the status of counsels of perfection which you need not follow. Day understood that Jesus, too, was considered a rigorist in his day, as can be seen in his disciples' disbelief that the rich young ruler was sent away by Jesus because he would not give up his wealth. Mammon being then, as now, a marker of divine blessing. And open, by the way, you notice in the New Testament the word mammon is used. It remains sort of untranslated. It just sits there. It's almost like a personification. It's a reification of wealth into a principle. Mammon, in other words, what Jesus isn't condemning isn't simply money in this abstract sense. Mammon means an ordered, a social situation ordered to its production, its ownership, and its meaningfulness. Mammon being then, as now, a marker, therefore, of divine blessing. And openly asked, the rich young man openly asked Jesus, the disciples then asked Jesus, who then can be saved? If rich people can't be saved, who can be saved? Obviously, God loves rich people. That's our whole theology. God loves rich people, poor people, not so much. Of course, Jesus said, well, God can do lots of things that humans can't. Dorothy Day was not deterred by accusations of rigorism of this type, which she saw, and I mean she just really saw with profound prophetic clarity that we must either hatch or go bad. She saw that a radicalization had to happen. As Karl Rahner said, the Christian of the future is going to be a mystic or we won't be Christians at all. I'm not a huge fan of Rahner, but blind squirrels finding acorns and all that stuff. All right? We need a revolution of the heart, Dorothy said, where the small band of Catholics that will remain are truly intentional and evangelical in their faith. And this realization was not unique to Dorothy Day. No less a light than Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict, stated already in 1967, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, in an interview that the church must accept the fact that she is going to become much, much smaller in the near future, since few there are who will make that decisional choice and will choose instead to float downstream with the culture. And he thus concluded, as Dorothy concluded, that the only Catholicism that remains is the Catholicism of those who consciously choose it in the face of all cultural obstacles. Thus, Dorothy and Peter Morin were not joking around or being cheeky when they said that today the living out of the Sermon on the Mount was no longer an option for the elite few, what Bishop Barron calls the spiritual athletes of the church, but must be the choice of all. We must be radical, paraphrasing Rahner, or we won't be at all. It is against this backdrop that I would like to discuss now Vatican II. Vatican II had its strengths, let's see here. Oh, Gucci Mama. All right. The council had its strengths and weaknesses, but in the end, it too represents, nevertheless, a watershed moment that must be embraced critically but lovingly in the option it presents. I know for many of you sitting here, I'll stop for a second and address this. Vatican II, you might as well be, this is your grandpappy's council, right? You might, wishing that boomers like me would just shut up about it already. I wrote an article once responding to an article by this guy, Adam somebody, in Crisis Magazine saying, hey boomer, get over Vatican II. And to be honest with you, I don't really care about Vatican II. It's an ecumenical council and all that. I don't care about Vatican II. What I care about are the ideas, the theological content of the Second Vatican Council. I'm being a bit flippant when I say I don't care about an ecumenical council. What I mean is what's important. I don't care if I reject the council, I hate its fruits. Okay, fine. But at least be aware of what it is that you say then you're rejecting. Because there are deep theological insights to this council that must not die, that must go on. All right, and I don't care where we get these ideas from, whether it's from the council or somewhere else. These ideas, born out of ressourcement and communio theology, must live on. Vatican II was a missionary council by its own definition. It was not a modernizing or liberalizing council, as the popular media both then and now would have us believe. Hans Kuhn had that wonderful hair, a fancy red sports car that he drove all over Rome during the council, and was the darling Swiss Wunderkind, ever ready to pronounce to a breathless and complicit media that the Catholic Church was dissolving itself. But this was not the voice of the council, nor in the other direction was the council inclined to engage in a pro forma reiteration of the categories of the old-fashioned neo-scholastic fortress Catholicism manuals with its security blanket syllogisms and woefully inadequate caricatures of modern forms of thinking. Many in the curial offices thought that the council would last 3 months and be over by the end of the summer as everybody has rubber-stamped the pre-written schemata. All the schemata had been drawn up, and the hope was that the bishops would give it all a thumbs up and then dash off to Piazza Navona for some pasta matriciana and some good wine. This was not the will of the council. The council's vision was sweeping and broad. Its goal was to re-evangelize the world through a missionary effort that would take the church's vast spiritual riches and place them in the modern public square as genuine interlocutors with a world made weary by the genocidal wars that was then of recent memory and the emerging threat of nuclear apocalypse. But in order to do this, the Council Fathers knew that a purely clerical effort would not do, and that the time was now for a lay revolution in the church. Very often in the history of the church, great spiritual leaders arose to reform the religious orders, which often ended in them breaking away from the main body in order to found a more rigorous, what we call discalced movement of radical Catholicism, unshod. Therefore, I like to say that in its universal call to holiness, the council was calling for a discalced laity, shorn of the purely contractual Catholicism so prevalent in the pre-conciliar church. They sought a more evangelical laity who would rise to the challenge of modernity and bring the gospel into the world in a radical way, a leavening way, but also in a way appropriate to their state in life. Thus, as I have often said, the heart and soul of the council can be seen in two things. First, it was a radically Christocentric council. My blog is called GaudiumEtSpes22.com. Gaudium et Spes 22, section 22, document, Church in the Modern World, begins with a very famous line, probably from Henry de Lubac. And to paraphrase, it essentially says, you don't know anything about humanity unless you know Christ. Only in the light of the incarnation does the mystery of man begin to take on coloration. This is the essence. And Karol Wojtyła, by the way, Pope John Paul had a direct hand in that segment of Gaudium et Spes as well. And so in reorienting theology, the council hoped to create a more evangelical Catholicism. Second, it sought to take this Christocentric message and, among other things, to apply it to the universal call to holiness, which it sought to declericalize and to emphasize that it is truly a universal call meant for all, as Dorothy Day had been saying for years. This was not a new doctrine in the church, but it had been muddied over with the sludge of a moribund clericalism and an infantilized laity. And this is no caricature. As I said before, something has to explain why the entire bottom fell out of the church's culture immediately after the council, and that explanation is easy to find. A church characterized by a rule-based clericalism and a purely contractual faith with the laity went wild after the council lifted the lid off of the ecclesiastical libido in the form of a softening of the rules in favor of a faith of intentional choosing. In a church unfortunately defined in the past by the boundaries of mere rules, when those rules are at least perceived as being removed or softened, then the boundaries go away as well. And that is what we saw happen. No boundaries. It was insane. George Michael calls it the silly season, and it was. It was silly. I mean, there are some people in here old enough to remember some of the crazy things that went on in that era. You wouldn't believe the stories. They're true. Sister Donald, I'm sure, has seen some of these things I'm talking about. The council was therefore right in its theology, but it was guilty of a double pastoral naivete. The first naivete was that it overestimated the strength of the internal faith life of the church up to that point. And the second naivete is that it underestimated the toxicity of modern culture to that same faith, and which was in great measure why the church had already been slowly rotting from within. To those who might be tempted to a certain romanticization of the pre-conciliar church, I will say this. As early as 1958, a young Joseph Ratzinger, again, future Pope Benedict, penned a famous article that hit like a bombshell in a German journal called Hochschild. And the English title is called The New Heathenism in the Church, or The New Paganism in the Church. And in that article, Ratzinger made the same observation I'm making here, namely, that despite outward signs of strength to the contrary, in fact, Ratzinger says, the pre-conciliar church, the church of his time in 1958, is living proof that statistics lie. And he says, you can, by all these outward metrics, vocations, schools, it seems like the church was booming. But he knew, as Dorothy knew and others knew, not so. There's a rot, there's a deep rot going on. And he said, despite the outward signs of strength to the contrary, the reality was the church had been hollowed out from within and had largely imbibed the pagan values of the modern world. It had become, in his words, a church of heathens who thought they were Christians. Others have noted this as well, and much earlier. You see it in literary figures like George Bernanos, whose Diary of a Country Priest was a literary, in the 1930s, was a literary exploration of the theme of the lonely holiness of a single priest within an ocean of French Catholic boredom and disbelief. You saw it in early 20th century historians like Christopher Dawson, who saw the bourgeois Catholicism of his day as a moribund institution in an advanced stage of decay. Theologian Romano Guardini saw it, a favorite of Pope Francis. So did philosophers Etienne Gilson and Joseph Pieper and a host of others. My point here is that this thesis of a rotted pre-conciliar church is not some idiosyncratic theory of my own making and Dorothy Day's own making. Therefore, the modern traditionalist belief that in order to overcome the post-conciliar turmoil, we simply need to go back to what things were like before the council scarcely rises to the level of nonsense. If Catholics were so happy and content with that form of Catholicism and its Latin liturgy, why did they so gladly and in an almost Dionysian orgy of cathartic, libidinous release toss it all aside in an absolute instant without blinking twice or looking back once? I saw it. Catholic, with a few exceptions, with the Lefebvrites and so on, Catholics rushed headlong into the brave new world of the Novus Ordo and everything else. The problem, therefore, is the council understood that the church needed holiness, but in its double naivete, failed to spell out the exact kind of holiness that is needed today, and chose instead to still speak in the vague platitudes of various theological bromides drawn from the past. The council was still too safe. Isn't that strange? Too safe. And in so doing, it failed to identify what kinds of saints we need today, with any specificity tailored to the challenge of modern culture. In short, the council, though radical in many ways, was still trying to square the circle of material continuity in doctrine and practice, in other words, a conservative message, and therefore had a tendency to articulate its message in church speak, in order to smooth over the various micro-ruptures it was indeed introducing, and it did. Sure, the council got the theology right, but as Ratzinger noted years later, perhaps they were too focused on getting the theology right and not focused enough on what the concrete pastoral fallout would be. But in the council's defense, it was caught in a bind. On the one hand, they wanted to reject the defensive insular fortress Catholicism mentality of the pre-conciliar era. She wanted to combat the errors of modernity, but knew that she could not do so with the old neo-scholasticism manuals and the syllabus of errors approach to things. On the other hand, she needed to counteract the errors of that same modernity, but wanted to do so positively by putting forward a better anthropology, a better humanism, Christologically grounded than that offered by modern culture. Think de Lubach's book, Drama of Atheist Humanism here. It wanted to build on what was good in modernity without, for all that, offering up a pinch of incense to its polyamorous idolatries. Sadly, the Catholics of today have long since stopped obsessing over where our pinches of incense are directed, which is one of the chief points Balthasar is making in the moment of Christian witness. The church, in both its clerical and lay domains, made its peace with mediocrity and its spiritually myopic materialism, and settled into a long winter's nap of somnambulistic lassitude, content to sublate the monogamy of our devotion to Christ underneath a host of other more penultimate desires: ethnicism, nationalism, consumerism, Americanism, all the isms. Treating Christ like an ancient palimpsest where the original image could only be recovered with great skill and effort. And so the bourgeois tail ends up wagging the Christian dog, which culminates in a thinly disguised rejection of sanctity, as I said before, as a subspecies of fanaticism. The universal call to holiness, championed by Vatican II and presciently called for by Dorothy Day and Peter Moran 30 years earlier, has been corrupted, inverted, and falsified by rendering the quest for holiness in ordinary life into its opposite. The statement that, quote, we can find holiness even in ordinary things becomes instead, quote, it's holy to be ordinary. And ordinary is then defined strictly according to the structures of plausibility constructed by bourgeois modernity. The claim of Dorothy and Peter, therefore, was that the attempt to domesticate our transformation in Christ through 1,000 paper-cut compromises with ordinary life is a form of idolatry. It is the idolatry of the everydayness that imposed itself upon us and insists upon our ascent to real life, as opposed to the fanaticism of those not of this world. And it is an idolatry which in a previous form is as old as the Christian faith itself. The Romans accused the first Christians of being antisocial and anti-human because the church insisted that our spiritual center of gravity resides outside of the nexus of everyday social commerce, and within the nexus of a regime of grace that explodes the old wineskins of the normal. To use Balthasar's phrase, in the early church, to be concentric to Christ meant to be eccentric to the world, and we need to recover that. What the early church, by contrast, dared its followers to do was to imagine that what seems to be most real, everyday, common sense, compromised living, is in fact an illusion, a spiritual illusion. And this is the spiritual crisis of our time, that we have bought into the illusion that the modern world is a proper definition of reality, of existence, that it comprises the totality of our horizon, and we have to fit within that horizon. This is what Dorothy Day said we cannot do. And the early church called us to dream differently and more radically. I just read a great article, I'm over time, I know, great article yesterday, I can't remember where it was, or who wrote it, I guess I shouldn't talk about it. But anyway, it was about how we're going to, he was talking about we are now in a post-authority church. Not in the sense that authority doesn't exist anymore, it does, but nobody cares about authority anymore. Nobody buys into it, nobody pays attention to it. And in some ways it's because an authority devoid of holiness, an authority devoid of this different horizon, is an authority that is compromised, and everybody knows it's compromised. Okay? And we need, therefore, to re-enchant the church. We need to rewild Christianity. We need to make Christianity weird again. As I said to Lizzie before, there's good weird and there's bad weird. I mean, there's bad weird. That's like the little kid who eats paste in first grade. Don't be like him. That's bad weird. But good weird, good weird. Saints are weird. Saints are freaks. We need more freaks. We need more freak saints. That's what we need. Okay? And guess what? The non-Catholic world, the non-believing world, now has a corner on what is considered sort of cool in that freak weird kind of way, in that bohemian sort of way. It's our inability to dream differently and to assert instead that this world and its logic of compromise is an end unto itself that I define, following Berdyaev, Peter Moore, and Dorothy Day, as the bourgeois spirit. The spirit has always been with us, but as Berdyaev points out, beginning in the 19th, and Dorothy Day loved Berdyaev. I've been told she didn't really know him very well, but I think she did. But beginning in the 19th century, it has been elevated into a strict and all-encompassing governing principle for our culture, religion, economics, and politics. But Dorothy and Peter insisted, in the face of accusations of their sectarian rigorism, the charge that they were utopian purists, they simply pointed the prophets to Christ and so forth. As I said, the Constantinian era is dead. We must now return to that fervor of those first Christians who refused to accede to Caesar's occupation of every space. Caesar occupied and claimed to occupy every space. Sound familiar? For them, the acclamation, Jesus is Lord, was more than a doxological prayer, was also a dangerous and potentially lethal affirmation that Caesar is not Lord, in our context, nor is Amazon or Elon Musk or Zuckerberg. On both the right and the left, the church in America and Europe is defaced with the graffiti of our vulgar preoccupations and seems no longer to have the spiritual resources to even desire something more Christ-centered. It's a demoralized reality. In earlier eras, reform was possible despite corruption and spiritual laxity, because people still knew where and what the center was that Christ presented in the Gospels. Today, even in the church, and trust me, I move in theological circles, and those of you who do know what I'm talking about. Today, even in the church, there are those who doubt the legitimacy of even having a Christological center, viewing the very notion of Christological center as oppressive, exclusive, which of course is merely code for we want our bourgeois comforts and conceits. And we want the culture that'll give it to us. And so we see that we're not opposed to centers after all. Mammon suffers no rivals. Some people might react to these words, call them harsh, judgmental, whatever. They might say I'm describing at best only the worst case examples and at worst a total straw man caricature. But I think this is just laying down smoke in order to create a fog that allows us to evade the obvious. Okay, and I'm not claiming I'm some kind of prophet, but I think Dorothy Day and Peter more and more. There is a time and place for critical and blunt observations. Sometimes you have to cut through the nonsense. And this is one of those times, and that was Dorothy Day's charism. She cut through the nonsense. Or put another way, the modern Catholic must have a jeweler's eye for BS. Thus we are confronted with a choice, and choose we must. We might think we can have our cake and eat it too, but we can't. That kind of halfway house Catholicism is no good. And the sad thing is, youth is a time for idealism, for just such heroism. And yet we generally do not tap into this deep reservoir of desire for meaning and purpose among the young, and opt instead for a church of Monte Carlo night fundraisers and basket raffles to build community. You know, homilies can be, and I don't mean to rag on priests do a good job, but there are so many homilies that are just atrociously awful. I call it sort of, it's nice to be nice to the nice homilies. Nothing bites, nothing challenges, nothing provokes. Everything has to remain within this safe space that we've carved out for ourselves. What we need, and when I say need, I mean we need it in the sense Dorothy said we needed this. We need parishes that confront the culture and attempt to flip the script of modernity's narrative, all the while making it clear that fence-sitting, bet-hedging Catholicism is not Catholicism at all. The Ernst Fall moment is upon us. But this choice is rarely presented, and instead we have settled into a kind of quiet resignation to the banality of it all. We hold diocesan synods. Maybe some of you are familiar with. My own wife served on one once. We hold these big synods with fancy title names like Renewing the Faith and the Spirit, Moving Forward Together as One. When in reality, all they usually turn out to be are discussions of what parishes are we going to close. And so we treat and we consolidate. We close parishes. We call it renewal. But we all know it for what it is. It's defeat. And in the midst of that fading is nothing but a debilitating indifference to the things of God. Ratzinger's blunt analysis of the situation already in 1958 caused him to conclude in a manner radically similar to that of Peter Moore and Dorothy Day that the only path forward is the path of demolition, followed by a reconstruction, a revolution that will be a revolution of the heart in the path of holiness. He states, in the long run, the church cannot escape having to dismantle, this is Ratzinger, quote, in the long run, the church cannot escape having to dismantle bit by bit its semblance of worldliness to become again what she truly is, a community of believers. All right, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm running out of time. I knew I was going to have to triage this, so I'm going to come to the end. Tyranny rises in exact proportion to the loss of real community and real COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the rise of racial tensions here at home, the surge of desperate immigrants fleeing conditions in their own countries that our own country helped to create, the rise of poverty and unemployment, the rise of drug addiction and the despair of homelessness, and the rise of an even scarier militarism now extending into space, cry out for the anti-politics of the Lord Jesus Christ and his kingdom, which is not of this world, but is for this world, paradoxically. We should therefore be saints who see that ours is a time of expectant preparation for the inbreaking of a new kingdom in the form of a divine love displayed in the events of the Paschal mystery in the Lamb who was slain. There is no issue stronger than the tissue of this love, and it is only this divine love expressed in endless hospitality and open-ended forgiveness in communities of love, of Christian faith, that can build our communities back again and save us from the noose of techno-capitalist militarist tyranny that is around our necks. Therefore, in order for that to happen in this current season of crisis, let our prayer be, he has cast down the mighty from their thrones, and he has lifted up the lowly. And that is what Dorothy Day did in her own small way. She resisted and she loved. Her resistance was a form of love, and so we too must resist. Only then can the church regain her credibility in the world. Nothing else will suffice. Not more meetings or stratagems or meetings about meetings and synods about synods or whatever, or pastoral plans or synods or position papers from the bishops on topics on which they have no competence. The competence of our pastors is the fostering of holiness. Raw, brutal, extreme, crazy as a Mad Hatter holiness. A holiness that causes people to stop short and ask, what the heck is that? To be different and sanely insane. The Church of Petrine structure is no longer held to be credible in the world. I believe in Petrine structure. I'm an Orthodox Catholic, but it's not held credible in our world anymore. We need to make it credible by living a hermeneutics of descent, kenosis, cross, in our own lives, which will provide the church for their only proper metric, rooted in praxis, for making doctrinal formulations and for settling doctrinal disputes. Last paragraph, I promise. The fact that the church may have committed errors in the past bothers me not one whit. I lose no sleep over it, and it does not engender in me a crisis of faith. Little children that are tortured and raped and then murdered by some sick sadist causes me far more existential dread than the fact that some pope once taught some howler of nonsense. And this is what Dorothy Day understood as well, which is why she believed that there is nothing so holy as the palm outstretched in the run of generosity. Today, we're all like a person adrift at sea who spies a rock jutting out from the water. And as we seek to cling to it, we curse the slippery moss that covers it. But it is a rock in the ocean, so of course it has moss on it. Better to find that floating beam of wood, that thin arboreal presence, which alone stands between us and the abyss below, and upon which our Savior, the only Savior, once hung. Dorothy Day, pray for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chapp, for your lecture. We'll have some time for questions, and I might ask if I can start it off.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Chapp, it seems that your choice and your response to modernity personally has been to found the Catholic Worker Farm. Now, some of the students here might be familiar with the Catholic worker movement, but perhaps have an image of the Catholic worker movement being something more urban and sort of more focused on nonviolent protest. So I wonder if you could kind of fill us in with that side of the Catholic worker movement and why you chose to fulfill that route.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why my wife and I decided to start a Catholic worker farm and not one of the urban houses of hospitality. It's because that part of the movement, which goes all the way back to Peter Moore in the 1930s, when they first had been eclipsed, had been forgotten, and a lot of it has to do with the history of the movement, especially in the 60s. When the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and all those sorts of movements were really front and center. And let's just put it this way, it was so much more exciting to be involved in those things than growing turnips for the local food pantry. All right? So it sort of fell out of favor. But in many ways, the Catholic worker farms were ahead of their time. They're what we would call today sort of localism. anti-globalism, sort of back to the landism. That's why we decided to do it. Plus, also, I'm a Nebraskan, so it's in my soul. Okay, it's in my soul. Even though I didn't grow up on a farm, knew nothing, my wife calls me the YouTube farmer because everything I know how to do I learned on the University of YouTube. I didn't know anything. I figured you'd put your finger in the ground and put a corn thing in it, and something came up 6 months later in there. But you know, so I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot. But that's why we did. Plus, also, we are very drawn to Benedictine spirituality, and sitting here tonight is, I want to introduce Sister Donald. Stand up, Sister Donald. I want everybody to meet Sister Donald. Sister Donald is a sister at Transfiguration Monastery, a co-founder of Transfiguration Monastery, Benedictine. And she lived for a year with Dorothy Day in New York City. And my wife and I are Benedictine Oblates, and we are associated with her monastery, and she's like our spiritual mentor. And so I wanted to gratefully thank you for coming tonight, Sister Donald, and blessing us with your presence. But I think a lot of, too, the Benedictine spirituality of Labora et Labora was very attractive to us.
Other questions? If you could raise your hand, I'll bring the mic by so that our folks on Zoom can also hear the question.
Thank you, Dr. Chapp. The article that you couldn't remember and the author you couldn't remember, would it have happened to have been John Rist, who published a piece recently precisely on that post-authority church? No, okay.
Just give you 1 second here, dude. Dude.
Only because the argument was very similar to the way you summarized it.
I'm back teaching.
Neither here nor there.
Okay. Here, I have the article on my, okay, it was in the European Conservative, unfortunately. Can Hermetic Magic Rescue the Church? Part 1, Acknowledging the Crisis and Breaking the Spell by Sebastian Morello.
Okay. It's similar to an argument that John Rist recently made. But my question regards, and I'm sorry I missed the very first part of your talk, but your initial introduction to Dorothy Day. Studying with a philosopher whom I greatly respect, I remember that in my own philosophical theological training that Dorothy Day was presented as someone with a bit of a political naivete. And I think that unfortunately really influenced many people, and this would have been back in, let's say, the late 90s or so, influenced a lot of the way that many people thought about Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. Now the reason I'm asking the question about maybe when you first encountered, or the way in which perhaps Dorothy Day was first presented to you, I think that interpretation of a certain political naivete may have been a certain reading and an understanding of Dorothy Day as trying to solve social problems through political means. But you seem to be making a very different argument. That in fact it was a Christological, very deep understanding that would have inspired the work, the Catholic work.
You know, I don't mean to forestall anyone. And by the way, Rist I like Rist. Good stuff. This is an excellent question, and because Dorothy Day was a complex person, I could ask Sister Donald to chime in too. She wasn't always completely consistent with her own principles. She was a human being, all right, and she was more of an activist than an intellectual. Peter Morin was more of the intellectual. Peter Morin wasn't much of an activist at all. He said, "Strikes don't strike me," and he was more about quietly building a subculture, benediction, whatever you want to call it, than Dorothy was. She was much more about direct political action. Remember, she started as a journalist and flirted with Marxism and these things. I think Dorothy had a very concrete understanding of social problems. And I therefore believe that she thought that there should be concrete solutions. She wasn't willing to simply dismiss the social injustices that she saw as, well, the poor you shall have with you always, or this is simply how the libido dominandi works out, you know, it's just the way it's going to do. She wasn't willing to accept that. And therefore, you know, I'm well aware that I emphasize this side of her that emphasizes her deep, deep, deep spirituality, her deep emphasis on holiness, her deep belief in charity, and concrete, direct, personal, one-on-one charity. I emphasize all that because in my opinion, precisely that's the image of her that you just brought up. And it is the image of her. She was just a political activist. She was a liberal and a communist and was out there. And what gets ignored is the profound Catholicism that animated her. I just had an article published about the prophetic anarchism of Dorothy. I could have done a whole talk just on that. Where I point out that she was opposed to the Leviathan of the modern state, so much so that she opposed Social Security when Franklin Roosevelt first came out with Social Security. She thought, well, that gives too much power to the government. So how could she possibly have been a communist or a Marxist when she's saying Social Security, that's bad, too much power to the government, it takes away charity. So if she had a flaw, one of the things that I think is that, and she does address this here and there, there's that old debate about justice versus charity, right? Dorothy definitely came down on the side that from a Christian perspective, we need to engage in personal charity. And that any system of social organization that makes charity something optional, because the state is now doing that for us, what we would call social justice, economic justice, she goes is bad, or at least trends in a bad direction. I'm not certain that that's true, but yet here's where she's not completely consistent, because Dorothy would also at the same time be in favor of, okay, so she says, God bless Fidel Castro in 1962, right? And people called her on that. So what are you talking about, God bless Fidel Castro? She goes, oh, of course I don't believe in the state repression and all that stuff. But she goes, can we not at least have a soft spot in our heart for a political revolution that is trying to help poor people? And so if there's a kind of naivete there, to me it's the naivete of a saint. I could be wrong about that. It's the naivete of a saint. She also said, she learned something from Peter Moore about love of enemies. And it's very interesting. She said Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, all of these people, they did horrible, horrible, terrible things. And yet Peter Moore taught me that love of enemy demands that we not impugn bad motives to people. And therefore, and this is often ripped out of context. She says, therefore, I have often thought that therefore I must say that these men were motivated by a desire to truly improve the human race. That's often by her critics, ripped out of context. See there, she was praising Lenin and Soviet style Stalinism. No, she wasn't. No, she wasn't. She was talking about love of enemies. So once again, to me it shows the side of Dorothy as a saint, as someone striving profoundly to be Christ-like, which means love of enemies. Now, and I'm not answering your question, because I don't know the answer to it. I really don't. Maybe, Sister Donna, do you want to add anything to this by any? I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't.
I would just underscore the fact that...
Here.
I would just underscore the fact that, she went to Mass every day. I would bring the mail up to her in the morning, and she'd be propped up in bed, her knees up with the Bible, and she said, this is my best time of the day when I can just meditate on Scripture for a couple hours.
Yeah.
Of course, she was older and not as active. But, yeah, she certainly was political, but I don't think she was naive. No.
She had eyes wide open.
Eyes wide open.
Can we take other questions? Cynthia, I think I saw your hand first.
Thank you. Throughout your talk, I've heard you bring in words like enchantment, the mysticism, these very powerful statements of the weird, crazy kinds of people that we need to be. What is a mystic, and how do we train mystics, and who's doing a good job of it? And what is the model? Like, where are the methodologies?
God dang, these are great questions. A mystic is someone who seeks after and largely achieves a sense of the presence of the transcendence in their lives as something real on an ongoing day-to-day basis. Not a fleeting oceanic moment looking at a sunset, but someone who has truly cultivated what Brother Lawrence would call the practice of the presence of God in their lives. So that's to me what a mystic is. It doesn't mean you're having supernatural charismatic. So I thank you for the question, because sometimes people misunderstand. I'm trying to say that we all need to have these supernatural experiences and so on. No, it means developing virtues that create in us different spiritual, I keep using this phrase, I get this from the sociologist Peter Berger, different spiritual plausibility structures. Because so long as we don't develop a countermeasure in a mystical direction, trying to cultivate the reality of God. That's why the whole beginning of my talk was about the nullification of God as a truly real thing. And my point is that we are a church filled with atheists. Myself, I'm infected with this same bacillus. That's why I'm so animated about it, because I feel it. I feel the worm turning within me. Oh, geez. You know, and I hate it. I hate it because it thwarts every single one of my efforts to take God seriously as an ongoing presence and reality in my life. Now, who is doing this the best? Quite frankly, I don't know. I really don't know. I think to a great extent, and I say this with some hesitation, it's being done outside of the Catholic Church quite often and in many ways. But I hesitate to say that because I think it's also going on in the Catholic Church. I just don't really know where. But my fear is you have these various enthusiasms in the church right now, whether it's radical progressivism or radical traditionalism or radical neocon Americanism, these sorts of isms. I think these can, and this is what Pope Francis means when he talks about ideology taking the place of proper theology and doctrine. He means we don't experience Christ. We're not experiencing this mystical presence of God in our lives as an ongoing reality. We've substituted instead some sort of reified image in our head of what an ecclesial ideology of what we think the church needs to be. And I think in those things we're doing a bad job. But I talk over the past 3 years since my blogs against my wishes went viral. I thought it would die. It didn't. I get hundreds of emails a week, and so many of them are from priests who are asking just this question you're asking. So I'm hesitant to criticize priests in the abstract. I've met some real great ones. I've met some real clunkers. All right, as have we all. All right. I would tell people when I was in seminary for a long time. I met two kinds of people in the seminary: people who would die for me, and people that I wouldn't cross the street to see because it's too scary. Right? And there were very few people, and I don't know if that's still true. It's still true. I don't know. But the point is, I don't want to rag too much on priests because they are under the gun today. They are so under the gun today, overworked, understaffed, and so on. But the point is, I get so many emails from them saying, we're doing this in our parish. I read your blog on this. Here's what we're doing in our parish. So I know this one guy, Father Harrison Arab in British Columbia. He runs a very popular podcast called Clerically Speaking with Father Anthony, who's somewhere in Ohio or something. But they're talking about this all the time. So I think it's going on, but it's a great question. I don't know where it's happened. Yeah.
So we have time for one more question.
It's not a question. Could I speak to that? I don't know where many things are going on, but I do know of two that are very powerful and important. The Centering Prayer Movement, which is international and very, very important and easy to get in touch with.
Yeah.
So you can do that, and it is expressly developed to help people practice the presence of God. And then another place that is doing that very explicitly and beautifully is the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which was founded by Father Richard Rohr. And that, again, is a place that fosters exactly that kind of training and is very useful.
Yeah. Centering prayer was big when I was in seminary. I was terrible at it. I called it holy sleep. Because the deeper I went into centering, because I was up all night smoking cigarettes with my buddies, that I would fall asleep in chapel. But I agree, I don't mean to make fun of centering prayer, but you have to be serious about it. And it has to involve not just a mental technique, it has to involve a complete commitment of the soul, which involves also a conversion of life. So that the reason why I bring up my example is because I was a young, immature little nitwit who just thought, well, I just go to chapel for half an hour and get quiet and Jesus will come to me. Well, he didn't. And because I wasn't disposed to it. Now, Sister Donald, once I get to speak to them, and she's at the Transfiguration Monastery, she sees people coming there all the time, seeking this kind of mystical encounter with Christ. And you tell me that your place is booming, so people want this kind of stuff.
I think I saw one more hand over here.
I know your name, Chris.
I'm Chris, everyone. Dr. Chapp, I was just wondering, just to kind of carry off, piggyback off the question of the lady behind me, more of a structural question, just in the sense, for the next couple of decades, what do you foresee, I guess, from an institutional standpoint, just in terms of the future bishops, and even Rome itself from the Pope itself, just in the sense, if you could construct your ideal of a Pope as to carry out this vision, or bishops that you would like to see carry out this vision, particularly here in America and in Europe, what would you do?
All right, that's a great question. I'll say two things. First, thank God I'm not Pope. I would have a guillotine put in St. Peter's Square, and every single grudge I ever had in my life, people's heads would be lopped off left and right. I would be the world's worst Pope for an hour. It would be a bloodbath as I'm purging all my grudges. But all joking aside, you know what, if I were Pope, and this is what I would hope, you know, we once had the papacy in Avignon, France. Right? So it's possible to move the See of Peter someplace else. Let's move it to Port-au-Prince. So the next Pope says, bye-bye Vatican, I'm going to live in a shack in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And anybody that wants to hear what the Pope has to say has to come to Port-au-Prince. And by the way, bring food, bring money, bring construction skills, help the people here. And okay, so you know, and I'm not being facetious. I'm talking about, this is what I mean when I say we need to re-weird and re-wild things. We need to shake things up. And as I love Rome. Rome's my favorite city in the world. I'm going there in November. I love St. Peter's. And so I say this, you know, I'm not saying we should sell St. Peter's. Let it sit there. Let a future Pope go there. But the next few popes, pick the poorest diocese in the world and go and move the See of Peter there. And I'm not being facetious. Now people would say, oh, what would happen to the Vatican diplomatic corps and blah, blah, blah. Well, that would still work. You'd still have your curial apparatchiks over in Rome, eating their pasta and running the curial offices. But the Pope, few assistants, living in poverty. That's what I would like to see. I think Dorothy Day would have loved that too.
So on that note, I'm going to invite everyone to please, let's continue the conversation, but in the context of a reception. We do have ice cream sandwiches in the back. Dr. Chapp, thank you so much for this lecture. Before you head out, one request, you will find surveys on your seat. If you could please fill those out, whether you're a community member, a student, a faculty member. Your responses are extremely helpful for us as we develop our programming. Once you're done filling them out, there's a basket by the ice cream sandwiches that you can deposit them. And then secondly, students, you are all invited to a lunch discussion tomorrow with Dr. Chapp. He is very kind to stay tomorrow. That will be around 1:15 p.m. in this building, room 314, right after the Cornell Catholic Mass and Rosary. So hope to see you there, and thank you again for being here, and thank you, Dr. Chapp, for this talk.
Thank you.